Hi, in this video we're going to be talking about the steps involved in hypothesis testing. Now, there's many books out there and they may have different steps. So you may have a book that says, well, there's 6 steps, 5 steps, 7 steps, 8 steps, 9 steps. Even I had a book that had 10 steps. So don't get hung up on the number of steps, just get hung up on the steps, right? So whether the book has 6 or 10 doesn't really matter. Some authors will break down some of the steps into more steps. The process is all the same. So if your book says it's 6, that's okay. Other people might break down that one step that, one author says is 1 step. Another one might break that down into multiple steps. But the process is the same whether your book says 6 or 10 steps, so don't get hung up on that. Now, each one of these things you could go through in great detail, and I have other videos on some of these aspects, but let's just talk about them really quickly. Of course, the first step is, what are we talking about here? We're hypothesis testing. Well, what is a hypothesis? How do I come up with a hypothesis? That's a class in itself, maybe. But anyway, this first step says formulate and you'll see HO and H1. That's a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Some of your books will have a HO and an HA, A standing for alternative. HO meaning 0. I say O. It's 0 for nothing, okay? But anyway, that's your hypothesis, right? I always have my students say, you have to say your hypothesis in your words. I believe this, right? I think this. And then you turn that statement into one of these little symbol things, which we'll see. Select an appropriate test. Hey, there's all kinds of statistical tests. And how do I know which one do I use? Well, there's a flow chart for that. And I'll show you that real quick in this video, but maybe I needed a whole video where we go through that. There's a flow chart. If this, then this is the test you use. If this is your situation, this is the test you use. So that's just deciding on what test you're going to do. Choose the level of significance. Ooh, that's that alpha thing. Well, that has to do with how confident you are. Now, there's a lot of way to describe confidence levels. And there's the scientific way, the probability of committing a type 1 error, right? But the truth is, how confident are you? How confident do you want to be that if you do all this testing, that it is, you're accurate, right? So that's kind of what this is, and you choose that. We'll get into that in a moment too. Collect data and calculate the test statistic. Okay, so obviously if you're really doing real research, that's the bulk of what you're doing, right? That's maybe you got a survey, maybe you've got some secondary data where you've got it off the internet, or you've got it from a reputable source like the U.S. Census Bureau, something like that. This is all your data. So you've got all your data, raw numbers, has to be normally numbers. There are some, nominal level tests where you have you're just counting things like how many apples and how many oranges, that kind of thing. But most of our statistical tests that you study about in statistics is numbers, that we can calculate things, right? We love, I don't, but a lot of people like math, and a lot of statisticians do, And if you're one of those people, that's great. If you're one of the people that just don't like math and you're taking this class because you have to, then that's okay too, because I like to look at it like, well, you let the computer do the calculation. And so we'll use Excel. In my classes, we use Excel. There's, of course, more advanced programs depending on what level you're at. Okay, but that's calculating the data, collecting and calculating the data. Now here you'll see the splits. Some of the books do not split here. And they'll just say, determine the critical value of the test statistic over here. Determine the critical value. And so this step is step number 5. And this chart, I really like it because it says determine the probability associated with the test statistic. Now, we'll do, in other videos, I'll walk through these steps. And you're going to do this, if we do it in Excel, and you calculate all this stuff in Excel, it's going to give you the critical value, and it's going to give you the probability associated with the test statistic. It's going to provide those two things. I always ask for those two things when I do an assignment. I say, what is the critical value? And then what is the p-value is what what it calls it in Excel. And again, if you don't know what all that is right now, don't worry about it, because each one of those things is a little deal that we'll have a video on to talk about. But some books will only have critical value here on this particular step. Number 6, determine if the critical value falls into the rejection region or the non-rejection region. So what is that region? That sounds like a place. Well, it's true, because what we're talking about here is a probability distribution. You've seen those curves. If you haven't, you need to go back, because that's really the beginning of this. I have a video on the normal curve. Take a look at that one. And the normal curve or non-normal curves, skewed curves, these are distributions, but it's basically a histogram or some type of a chart that has all the data in it, right? And we're going to slice it up, and we're going to say, if my calculated statistic from step number 4 falls into a rejection region, I'm going to reject the null hypothesis. If it falls into the fail to reject region, that means I don't reject the null hypothesis, and I could say that supports my alternative hypothesis, right? And really, at this point, the alternative hypothesis is your hypothesis. What do you think? You're testing the null hypothesis, and if you reject the null hypothesis, then that supports your hypothesis. What determines that is this step number 6, right? We're going to compare our test statistic with the critical value, right? And we can see the p-value, and what we're comparing the p-value to is the level of significance. Okay, so this one here, probability associated with the test statistic is compared to the alpha level, and the critical value is tested is compared to the critical value. Okay, so that is number 6. Number 7, reject or do not reject. I just kind of really said that, right? So you can see here how some authors could roll that number 7 up into the number 6, right? Because it says determine if it falls into rejection or non-rejection, and that's going to tell you where it falls, whether I reject or I fail to reject the null hypothesis. Now, at that point, it says here, it says marketing, because it's a marketing book I pulled this from, marketing research, but it says draw a research conclusion. And that really is your final thing. Now, a lot of people get this wrong. I mean, I had a whole lecture on how many times students get this wrong. I go through all this math. I've done all these things. I've got everything perfect. I did it right. I got 100% on my paper up to here, or on my Excel sheet, or whatever you're doing. And then I missed this one. And people do. But that's a discussion from another day, right? But draw my conclusion. So that's why I say the easiest way to understand this is, here, number 1 is, here's my hypothesis, that's the H1, and here's the hypothesis if it doesn't support mine, and then you determine if it's rejected, the null. If it falls into the reject the null, then that would support my hypothesis, and that my conclusion would be my hypothesis is supported, right? Okay, so that's it. That's the steps.